Well, I have another special guest here for you today to talk about the December 25th date and maybe give you some insight into that date that you've never heard of before. I know when I read this gentleman's article, I had never heard a lot of the things that he talked about. So today we're going to be talking to Dr. T.C. Schmidt. He received his PhD in ancient Christianity at Yale University. He's got several interests that touch upon the historical Jesus, the formation of the New Testament, patristic, eschatological thought, the history of Christianity in Syriac and Arabic contexts. He's published translations from Latin, Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, and these include translations from Ibn Khatib Qasar, a 12th century Arabic Christian writer, Ishodad of Merv, a 9th century Syriac writer, and Hippolytus of Rome, a 3rd century author whose writings have been preserved in Greek and Latin. Most recently, he published a monograph with Cambridge University Press in which he traces the formation of the New Testament and the reception of the book of Revelation in the Eastern churches. Its title is Revelation and its Eastern Commentators Making the New Testament in the Early Christian World. He's currently preparing a monograph for Oxford University Press on the ancient Jewish historian Josephus and his description of Jesus, and he is currently a professor at Fairfield University where he teaches on the New Testament and Christian history. And I had an absolute wonderful time discussing this subject of December 25th, specifically in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome. So without further ado, let's talk to Dr. Schmidt. Welcome, brothers and sisters. We've got a special guest today. This is, I'm guessing, Dr. Thomas Schmidt. That's the proper way to say it. So, from the state of Connecticut, I've invited him on the channel here to discuss more about the December 25th date. We've been doing that for the last couple of videos on the channel here.
Well, thanks for having me on, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a scholar of the New Testament and of Christian history, the early church, and also Eastern Christianity. And I've got a lot of broad interests. I'm very interested in the formation of the New Testament. I'm interested in early Christian eschatological thought, historical Jesus studies, things like that. But I'm also interested in the date of Christmas.
Yeah.
And I actually came upon that topic inadvertently, and it's because I was translating the earliest Christian commentary on Scripture, which is by a guy named Hippolytus, and it's on the book of Daniel. And I was doing it because I was interested in eschatology, and I came across this fascinating passage where he seems to say that Jesus was born on December 25th, and that led me down one path and then another, and pretty soon I did an article on that, and I've written some other stuff on that as well.
So I ran across your article a couple of weeks ago when I was doing some research on the December 25th date. I dug as far as I could dig online, and you were one of the names that popped up. The article was titled, let's see, I've got here, Calculating December 25th as the Birth of Jesus in Hippolytus. Put out in 2015. I think it was a Brill article, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was with Vigilia Christiana, which is published by Brill.
Okay. And I also ran across some old blog posts that you made back, I think, in 2010 and 2011. I found those, and at the top of the internet, it said the Wayback Machine.
Yeah.
So, and I read all of those and was reading all the comments underneath it. I'm a Bible nerd. So let's start with that fragment of the commentary on Daniel from Hippolytus there. And I have the 10-volume set. I have the 1986 set put out by Erdman's of the Nicene Fathers.
Yeah, I got it in the background right there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it. So when I pulled, I think it was like it was the first in the first 3 or 4 volumes was Hippolytus's writings, and I pulled it up and I didn't see anything about December 25th or 8 days before the calends of January. So talk to us a little bit about the manuscript variants in regards to that.
Yeah, great question. So the commentary on Daniel is one of those that's fallen victim to a lot of problems. It was a very famous commentary in the ancient church, and it was copied, relatively frequently. But unfortunately, all the manuscripts that we have of it are relatively incomplete, except for one that is fairly complete, but portions of it were illegible. And so when a critical edition is when a scholar goes and collects all the manuscripts, or at least all the main manuscripts of a work, and compares them all together and prints off a nice edition with footnotes indicating variants. When that happened, I think it was Nathaniel Bonvech did it. I believe that was his name. And he did it in like 1897. It was more than 100 years ago. But he
Hmm.
couldn't read some of the passages in that manuscript. And that awaited some new technology where you could take pictures with different white wavelengths of light to reveal these passages that had been damaged. So that's, I think, one reason why this commentary has gone unnoted. Another reason is that the manuscripts themselves, at this particular passage where Hippolytus talks about when Jesus was born, they disagree. And so some of them say December 25th. One of them, I believe, or maybe it's an early quotation of the passage by another author, doesn't give a date, and that is the source that is translated in the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers series. But
Okay.
then there's even a third variant. There's another manuscript that has a third variant that gives kind of a nonsensical, incomprehensible date where it gives an incomplete date. So you're reading along and then all of a sudden it doesn't really fill out the date formula. It starts and then stops. So there's three different options for it when you look at the manuscripts,
Hmm.
and scholars have debated about which one of those is authentic, because
Hmm.
it certainly seems like a scribe, either on purpose or by accident, changed something. And I don't want to rush to assumptions, because scribes are often dealing with damaged manuscripts that are 200 years old. They can't read it and they think they see something. So whether it was by accident or on purpose or whatever,
Sure.
something got changed. And the question is, what? What got changed? Was it
Hmm.
the December 25th date? Was that original, or was it these other dates, or did he not give a date at all?
Hmm.
And this is important because your viewers should know that Hippolytus is writing around the year 200, maybe
Right.
220.
Right.
He is early. This is an early writer. He's writing when Christianity was still greatly persecuted in the Roman Empire. And in fact, he's writing before the feast for Sol Invictus, the pagan sun god.
Hmm.
Before that feast was established as December 25th. So if Hippolytus were to say Jesus was born on December 25th, it means that he's not getting this from contemporary Roman pagan celebrations, because those didn't exist yet when he
Hmm.
was writing.
Hmm. So, did I understand you to say that some of the manuscripts of that document say December 25th, or is it that they say 8 days before the calends of January? And that
They say 8 days before the calends of
okay,
January. The Romans, they express dates, as you know,
sure,
differently than us.
okay,
So
okay,
when I translated, I translated it as December 25th. But
sure.
uh,
Inclusive counting, I guess it would be make it December 25th from January the 1st.
yeah,
So you do, and I believe I read on one of your blog posts, it wasn't in the Brill article, but on the blog post, I think you said that you did believe that that was the best reading of that text.
the
And you said
December
there are other
20th.
scholars that disagree, but you said that was the best reading of the text.
You're referring to the December 25th date?
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's a difficult question.
Okay.
I think, and we'll get into this, I'm sure. I think that
Yeah.
Hippolytus did think Jesus was born on December 25th,
Okay.
but that doesn't necessarily mean he said it in that particular passage. I think he
Okay.
does it elsewhere,
Okay.
but so I think it's likely that he said December 25th. But I've Hippolytus is one of the figures that I've studied very intensely, and I've
Hmm.
translated some of his works, and he's not the most consistent thinker. So
Hmm.
it wouldn't surprise me if the original story was that he actually wrote one date and then later changed his mind, or that
Hmm.
he maybe even put two dates down, or he does that in other places. So it's not inconceivable that he did believe Jesus was born on December 25th, but came to that conclusion before or after, or changed his mind or something like that. But certainly I think that at some point, certainly by the end of his life,
Hmm.
he had settled, I think, on December 25th.
Okay. So let's go to the Canon of Hippolytus. You mentioned this in the Brill article on calculating December 25th as the birth of Jesus. And the Canon of Hippolytus, if I understand it right, I went back and read your article again today. It mentions a lunar table that calculates Passovers. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit about what got you starting to study that particular document in regards to the birth date of Christ.
Before I get into that, I'll just say that at this point that we're at in our discussion, this is where scholarship kind of stopped as far as Hippolytus and December 25th birthday of Jesus went, because scholars, they read that passage in the commentary in Daniel, and they couldn't decide which reading
Sure.
was authentic, and
Okay.
scholarship just kind of stopped there for a very long time. And when I was researching this, I came across the work, like you said, of Hippolytus called the Canon, and like you said, this is well, at least what's left of it. We don't have all of it, but what's left of it is a table of dates. It's an ancient calendar meant, like you said, to calculate the date of Passover. As your viewers are probably aware, the Passover, it shifts in the
Sure.
calendar back and forth. It's hard to predict exactly when it's going to be. And in our day and age, we can just go on the internet and figure out when it's going to be. But you couldn't do that in the ancient world. And it was frustrating.
Yeah.
They want to plan ahead. So Hippolytus decided to make this calendar. And he thought it wasn't just any calendar. He
Mm,
wanted it to be a perpetual calendar. So it was going to be valid forever, for all time, so that
mm,
you could look at any date in the future and figure out exactly the day of the week that Passover was going to fall. And the great thing about this in Hippolytus's mind was that you could also go in reverse. So you could see the date of any previous Passover
mm,
according to Hippolytus as well. And so what Hippolytus did with this table is he not only put down all the dates, and it's this cyclical 19-year cycle. I think Hippolytus had a different
okay.
number, but whatever the case is, it would recycle. He thought that the Passover would cycle through on a consistent basis, and you could just keep repeating the calendar over and over again. And
Hmm.
because of that, what he realized was that he could go through the Bible and he could figure out like when exactly the Passover was when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt.
Oh, wow.
And he could go through and figure that out, because as long as he knew how many years ago it was, he could figure out the exact day. He could figure out the Passover of Jesus's Last Supper or crucifixion. He could figure out all these other things. So he went through the Bible and picked out these various Passovers that are mentioned, and
Hmm.
then in the calendar he made notes about when those biblical Passovers corresponded with which date in the calendar. And it turns out that one of those notes, so he'd said that the crucifixion of Jesus is on there. He calls it the Passion of Jesus. The Exodus is on there, but some other stuff is on there as well. But he also puts a note down for what he calls the Genesis of Christ.
Mm,
And it's the Greek word Genesis, the same exact word that's used for the first book of the Bible.
right.
And the debate in scholarship was always, what does he mean by this? Genesis means origin, beginning.
Sure.
And some scholars thought this must mean birth, and he's referring to the birth of Jesus. Others thought maybe he's referring to the conception of Jesus,
Hmm.
and because he places the Genesis of Jesus on the Passover, he actually puts it in early April.
Hmm. Hmm.
If it refers to conception, 9 months later is right around December 25th. I mean, if you go exactly 9 months, it's like January 2nd. So,
Right.
a week
Right.
earlier, hey, Christmas
Yeah.
baby. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting little tidbit to try and figure out what that word actually means. And so what I did in my research and in the article that you're referring to
Hmm.
is I used a Greek database that has all the Greek works that have ever been written in antiquity in searchable computer form,
Hmm.
and I searched the works of Hippolytus for the word Genesis, and there was like 100 and something times he uses the word, and I looked at every single one of them to figure out what does he mean by this.
Mm,
And I also looked at his contemporaries. I looked in ancient Greek medical literature that refers to embryology and stuff, and I think I show, I think, fairly persuasively that this word probably refers to conception,
mm,
not to birth. And that means that he would have thought Jesus was born sometime later. December
mhm.
25th is a good possibility. We don't know
Yeah.
yet. At this point, I didn't know. I just thought it was a viable option, December 25th, because if someone's conceived in April 2nd, they could be born on December 25th, but they could be born a lot of other days too. So
Sure. Yeah.
uh, I should mention the ancients were very aware of a 9-month gestational cycle. So
Okay.
they knew it was about 9 months. So it's something that
Yeah.
is important in the argument.
And I believe it was the Armenian church, they still actually celebrate Christmas on January the 6th.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was done anciently. And so that kind of, goes
Yes.
right along with that time period as well.
Yeah.
And is this word Genesis, this is the word you bring up a few authors outside of Hippolytus around the same time period, and then you talked about the other uses of Genesis in Hippolytus.
Yeah.
And you come to the conclusion that the word Genesis, it could refer to birth, but it can also refer to conception.
Yeah.
You bring up the Gospel of Matthew, and in
Hmm.
Matthew 1:18, there's an interesting use of Genesis there. Tell us about that, how that correlates.
So in most English translations, if you read Matthew 1:18, it will start off by saying the birth of Jesus Christ happened in this way. But the term for birth, there's several different words that you could use in Greek to refer to birth. And in
Mm-hmm.
this case, Matthew chose to use the word Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that if you keep reading the passage, it seems like he's referring to conception
Yeah.
because it reads the genesis of Jesus Christ happened in this way. After his mother was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child by the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's conception. That is not birth. And so that's one of the linchpins I used. There's other quotations. For instance, Galen, he's the founder of Western medicine. Him and Hippocrates, he was a contemporary of Hippolytus, a loose contemporary of Hippolytus, and he has a lot of medical works. And um, he says that he's referring to how embryos, babies develop in their mother's womb,
Mm-hmm.
and he says this. He says, but with Genesis, the genesis of the animal in the womb, the matter referring to semen is abundant. And so he
Mm,
clearly is referring to conception there,
sure.
not to birth, because he's talking about what's happening in the womb
Yeah.
when the seed meets the egg, so to speak. And there's
Yeah.
several other passages that we could go over as well.
Yeah. Okay. So from there, you talk about something called, if I'm pronouncing this right, the Chronicon of
Yeah, the
Hippolytus.
Chronicon.
Okay. And this is a record of his from creation up until his present day, roughly 235 AD,
Yeah,
somewhere right in
yeah,
there.
yeah,
And there's, let's see, Chronicon 698 to 700 mentions the generation of Christ. And then 686 to 688 mentions from his generation to his passion. Um, and you talk a little bit about that word generation. I think that's from the Latin,
yeah.
generatio, or
Hmm.
something like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So tell us about how does the work of Hippolytus in the Chronicon parallel the canon that we just talked about?
So they're complementary works. Hippolytus, he was a Christian theologian. He was a homilist. He loved preaching. He wrote commentaries. He also was really interested in chronology, which is why he has that canon that we talked about. He also has this work called the Chronicon, where he does a number of things in it. But one thing he tries to do is document all of world history from the beginning, Genesis 1, straight up to his present day. And he goes through much of the Chronicon is kind of like a list where he's just listing things out. And I was translating this. Unfortunately, much of it is no longer preserved in Greek. We only have it in
Mm,
a Latin translation.
okay.
So
Okay.
that's why all of a sudden we're talking about the same guy but a different language, because the passage that we're going to focus on is only present in Latin. It's also present in Armenian, also, by the way.
Okay.
And when he starts getting up to the time of Jesus, he starts throwing some dates out for
Hmm.
for Jesus's life, and he uses the Latin word generatio. He says, the generatio of Christ, and he says Jesus was 30 years old, that he died in a certain time frame, blah blah blah. All of that matches with the canon perfectly. You can tell it's the same author. He's doing the same exact stuff. What's interesting though is that as Hippolytus is tallying the years from creation, he mentions that the generatio of Christ, he says, was, let's see, um, he mentions that the generatio of Christ was, I think he says 5,502
And two.
years and 9 months, if you do the math,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
9 months from creation.
Okay.
And I was translating that, and I thought, well, that's weird. He's got this 9 months hanging out there. What's that doing there? And
Uh-huh.
I started, doing some back of the envelope calculations, and I realized that he's giving a specific date for the birth of Jesus. He's saying that it was 5,500 and I think it's 2 years. Forgive me if I'm off for, yeah,
You're right.
5,500, 2 years and 9 months from creation.
Mhm.
And I thought, hey, maybe that means if he gives us somewhere, if he somewhere gives us the date that he thinks the world was created, Hippolytus, he was what we would call a 6-day creationist. So
Mhm.
he thought there was a calendar date. And if he gives us a date somewhere, we can just add 9 months to that and
Mhm.
figure out when Jesus was born. So
Okay.
that's another piece of my argument that it's a clue where, hey, if we got one more thing to find out, and then we could finally discover when Hippolytus thought the world began, and therefore when Jesus was born.
Yeah. And so Hippolytus believed that the world began on March the 25th. Am I right?
Yeah, so I have to
Okay.
do in my article, I got to do a little bit of gymnastics to figure this out, but it
Uh,
becomes pretty clear. There's several interlocking arguments, but one piece is there's a later kind of chronographer. He's writing 30 years or so after Hippolytus, and he's responding to Hippolytus. He never mentions him by name, but it's pretty clear. And he mentions how my predecessors, almost certainly referring to Hippolytus, he says, my predecessors thought creation was on March 25th.
mhm.
And of course, 9 months after March 25th is December 25th.
Sure,
So,
sure.
so that was a good clue. Another good clue is that he clearly, in his Chronicon, when you look at what he's doing, he clearly
Mhm.
thinks that the turning of the year, for us it's January 1st. For him, though, he thought the turning of the year was somewhere around the vernal equinox,
Sure.
which was March 25th to him,
On the
which
Julian calendar, right?
yeah, and the Julian calendar, it's not the astronomically correct date, but
Sure,
it was the date the Romans believed was the vernal equinox. So
sure.
that gives us a clue that he's hovering. It's going to be somewhere around
Mhm.
March 25th. But the clincher is that if you take the Chronicon on one hand
Mhm.
and the canon on the other, and
Mhm.
you run Hippolytus's calculations through them, you can use the Passover table of the canon to figure out when he thought the world was created.
Mm.
And I do that calculation in my article. It's not I used another scholar had done that in the past, George
Mm.
Ogg, and I use his work. And it turns out that when you do that, when you plug in the numbers, the canon spits out March 25th. And so you've got these multiple levels of confirmation that Hippolytus thought the world was created on March 25th, and he thought Jesus was born 9 months after the anniversary of the creation of the world, which is December 25th.
Yeah, and it looks like that there were other authors that believed this March 25th creation of the world simply because, like you said, it was under the Julian calendar, the date of the vernal equinox,
Yeah,
which what we would call March 2020 or 21 now.
yeah,
And then I remember reading something about how that they would say that the sun was created on the fourth day,
yeah,
which would be March 28th, and then some people
yeah,
calculated from that
yes,
date or something like
yes,
that.
yes. Yeah, so
Okay.
ancient chronologists, they really got into things. I mean, they thought they could pin this thing down by almost the hour of
Hmm.
when creation happened. And so we know that there was a debate in early Christianity about when the first Passover was, because
Okay.
they believed that when God created the heavens and the earth, that the moon was created on day 4.
Hmm.
So but the problem is that the question is, when does the day begin? Does it begin in morning or does it begin in evening?
Hmm.
And then what phase of the moon was the moon created in? Because the Passover has got to be a full moon.
Hmm.
So they thought, well, he's got to do it. He did it on the vernal equinox, the perfect balance between light and darkness. He must have created the moon full. So that very first moon would have been a Passover moon, because the Passover is the first full moon after the vernal equinox. So,
Hmm.
but then there's this even other debate about well, wait a second here, because the Passover is when we see the moon. So you got to
Hmm.
see it in the sky. And Hippolytus, so even though Hippolytus thought the moon was created on day 4, he really thinks the Passover is not until the next day,
Hmm.
because the next day, the day would have begun at dusk
Hmm.
when the moon came out and was observed. And
Sure.
so he tweaked it a little bit to put the first Passover on the 5th day of creation,
Hmm.
instead of the fourth day of creation, like some other chronologists want to
Fascinating.
believe.
Very interesting. Tell us a little bit about the difference between two spellings of Genesis and how that
Yeah.
correlates. You mentioned the one spelling of Genesis with one noon, I believe it is, and
Yes.
then there's a double noon.
Yes.
And I remember reading something about this. I have a book in my library called the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. I think it was one of the earlier books by Bart
Bar
Ehrman,
Ehrman?
and he talks about. I think it's in Matthew chapter 1. He talks about some of the manuscripts having the Genesis with the two noon, and that just came to my mind today when I was reading
Oh,
your
I gotta
article
check that
again.
out. That'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, yeah. So it's in that book somewhere. I have to
Okay.
fish it out. But tell us the difference between the two spellings and what the significance is.
So in Greek, the word Genesis, I argue it could refer to birth, but it usually and most likely refers to conception.
Okay.
And that's when obviously Genesis is a flexible word. So when it's used in other contexts, it has nothing to do with birth or conception. And the book of Genesis is a great example of that. But
Yeah.
there's another Greek word it not only sounds a lot like Genesis, it looks a lot like it when it's spelled. And
Mm.
it's instead of the Greeks would not say Genesis, they would say Genesis, and then this other word they would say Genesis, and it's spelled slightly differently. There's an extra nu, and then instead of an iota, there's an eta. But other than that,
Okay.
it's pretty much exactly the same. And the reason why this is important is because Genesis refers to conception, Genesis refers to birth. And
Mm.
so, and these are very subtle differences, and it's something that is ambiguous to many non-Greek speakers. And so, I give an example of like a Syriac author who totally botches it when he's trying to he reverses it.
Mm.
But he does it like he correctly states the difference, and then in the next sentence confuses it because it's very confusing. I mean, they spelled almost identically. It sounds almost identical. The meaning is roughly similar. I mean,
Mm. Mm.
Genesis could refer to birth. It usually refers to conception. So this is important because something that I skipped over
Mm-hmm.
when I was explaining things is that 9 months that is in the Chronicon that's so important for determining when Hippolytus thought Jesus was born. Well, it looks like if you add up Hippolytus's numbers, there's a bit of a contradiction there because he says that the generatio of Jesus was 9 months after the anniversary of the creation of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But then immediately afterwards, he gives some numbers that imply that the generatio of Jesus was on the anniversary of the creation of the world.
Mm.
And both of those can't be correct. And remember, we're dealing with something that's in Latin, not in Greek. And so I hypothesize that what's probably going on here is that Hippolytus said Genesis in one passage, he said
Mm-hmm.
Genesis in the other, and the Latin translator has flubbed it. And I show that in ancient Latin translations of the New Testament, ancient Syriac translations of the same translators did the same exact thing, where they missed out on the distinction between those two words. And
Mm.
understandably, I mean, they're so similar that unless you're a true expert in the language, you're probably going to miss.
Yeah. Do you think that Hippolytus, and you also mentioned a possible document from Julius Africanus, I think that's debatable there, but
Yeah.
the document is there, but who the author of it I think is debatable. Do you think that they were right in positing December 25th? Was it just a theory? Is this just like this is an early theory? This is something that you think they were right on the money, or this is just what they believed? What's your view of that?
So you mean, do I think Jesus was actually born on December 25th? Is that?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've thought a lot lot about this. So
Uh-huh.
I'm suspicious. I doubt it. I could be convinced. I've got some
Yeah.
scholarly friends that are on the opposite end where they think this tradition is so strong that it must go back to some ancient thing. I
Okay.
don't agree, though. I think that if you look at Hippolytus, if you look at Julius Africanus, who's a contemporary of Hippolytus,
Hmm.
who seems to be using the same numerical math to figure out the birthday of Jesus. If you look at Clement of Alexandria, he's an older contemporary of Hippolytus. He's
Hmm.
doing the same stuff, and
Hmm.
he's even using the same terminology, Genesis, and the verb for genesis, to beget.
Hmm.
He's using the same stuff. They all are sharing this assumption that Jesus was conceived on the Passover, maybe also the vernal equinox, sometime both, but sometimes just the Passover, and that he was born about 9 months later. But the dates that are given by Clement of Alexandria, Clement gives a number of dates. He says some people
Yeah.
think this, some people think this, some people think this.
Yeah.
The dates that are given by them and by other names I haven't mentioned, they differ. Some of them do say December 25th, but some of them say January 6th, like you mentioned. And
Sure.
Clement mentions other dates as well. And
Yeah.
I think what's going on here is that they're all thinking that Jesus was conceived on the Passover,
Hmm.
and they're convinced of that. And so they think, well, look, if I can just figure out the date for that Passover, then I can
Hmm.
figure out when he was born. And they seem to, not all of them, but many of them assume Jesus had like a perfect 9 month gestational period. Hippolytus didn't. He counted 9 months from a different point. But um, that, I think that's what they're doing. And
Okay.
so to me, the most ancient tradition and the one that's most consistent is the idea that Jesus was conceived on the Passover, that the
Okay.
angel Gabriel appeared to Mary on that day. So that's the question. That's the real question, is where did that come from?
Hmm.
Because that's the earlier one. It's in the 2nd century already,
Hmm.
and it's totally widespread. I mean, it's fairly undisputed. There are a few folks who will say that Jesus was not conceived, but they'll say that he was born on the Passover.
Hmm.
But I actually think what's going on with those guys is that they're a little bit later than these earlier folks, and that they're misinterpreting the word for Genesis, and
Hmm.
they think that these earlier folks are talking about birth when they're really talking about conception.
Yeah.
So I think that's the more interesting question, is where did this idea that Jesus was conceived on the Passover come from?
Now, you mentioned Clement of Alexandria, and I noticed when I first started writing a paper, that's what got me started about all this. I started writing a paper because all of the papers that I found were, when we read you scholars, they're a lot of times hard to follow.
I
So
know.
I have to slow down and read and reread. And so I was trying to make a paper for the general public. And the first thing I ran across was Clement of Alexandria in the Stromata,
Yeah.
or
Yep.
Miscellanies, I think.
Yep.
And of course, in my ante-Nicene fathers set, it sounds like it's talking about the birth of Christ.
Yeah.
When he says there's different people here that believe his birth was on this day of the Egyptian calendar, that day of the Egyptian calendar. And then the more I began to dig, especially with your article, I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe Clement here is not referring to the birth. He's
Yeah.
referring to the conception. But
Yes.
he
Yeah.
does mention, I think he mentions dates that correlate with, one of them is even late May, like May the 20th, the 25th day of Pakon
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
Egyptian calendar
Yeah.
may translate to what we call around the end of May. And then there was another one like that would be maybe around the vernal equinox, Farmuthi, I believe the name
Yep.
of that
Yep.
Egyptian month
Yep.
was.
Yep. Yeah.
So we have dates ranging now from March 25th all the way to the end of May, which is still, I guess, a spring conception, but
Yeah.
counting nine
So
months would put the birth anywhere from, let's say, December 25th, maybe to late January, early February.
yeah. Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Clement is a fascinating passage. So this is one thing that I think my article revealed for the first time, was that passage that in the ante-Nicene Church Fathers, and I think that still is the only complete English translation of the Stromates of
Okay.
Clement. Um, that passage translates everything as birth, if my memory serves.
Mm-hmm.
And but if you look at it a couple times, I argue he's not referring to birth, he's referring to conception. He's using he's using a different word, genesis, or the verb form of it,
Mm-hmm.
and then he'll switch to the verb form of genesis for birth. And so he goes back and forth between conception and birth. And when you chart it all out, you
Mm-hmm.
find that he thinks that Jesus was conceived. One of the possible dates that he gives
Mm-hmm.
is the vernal equinox for the conception of Jesus.
Sure.
And what's interesting, though, is that in the Egyptian calendar, the vernal equinox was a different day than the vernal equinox in the Roman calendar. So
Yeah.
it was more astronomically accurate in Egypt. So he puts the one possibility is the conception of Jesus, around March 20th, 21st, and then the birth of Jesus on December 20th, 21st. But he's using the same exact ideas that Hippolytus is, where he thinks Jesus is conceived on the Passover. He thinks he's also conceived on the vernal equinox, and then he's born 9 months later.
Mm.
25th of Pashan, I have to confess that I need to look into that, because I used to think that was May
Okay.
also, but
Okay.
I read something recently that implied it was actually referring to April, which would make it line up with the Passover more
Sure. Yeah.
than May.
Sure, because the Passover could fall in early April.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely could, even
Yeah.
mid-April or later. So,
Yeah.
I think Clement is a great he's a great piece of evidence for what's called the calculation theory, which is what I ascribe to, which is that the
Hmm.
the the birthday of Jesus on December 25th, it was not chosen because of some correspondence with a pagan festival. It was
Hmm.
chosen because people were convinced that Jesus was conceived on the Passover, and they were just trying to figure out which Passover that was, because it moves around the calendar. And then they were calculating out, 9 months or what have you, to figure out the date of birth, which is why they're settling on December 20th or 21st, December 25th, January 6th, and these kinds of
Hmm.
dates, because that's all about 9 months from when the
Yeah.
Passover occurred.
The calculation theory seems to hold a lot more weight patristically. It seems like when you read the church fathers, that especially prior to the legalization of Christianity, they are not having a desire to want to try to envelop any kind of pagan practice
Oh
or anything
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah. I
I
was
mean,
reading
Hippolytus.
Tertullian the other night, and he was just like coming against Saturnalia really, really hard. So
Who was which author? Oh,
Tertullian,
Tertullian.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
in his
no, no.
apology and then on
Yep,
idolatry. I mean, he was
yep,
talking. It sounded like that he was reprimanding some of his fellow Christians for going over and participating in the Saturnalia festivities of Rome.
yep,
So it
yeah,
just doesn't make sense that they would say, "Yeah, let's just grab this date from a pagan religion and
yep.
let's plop it onto the."
I completely agree. That's something that would have happened hundreds of years later, maybe, in the fifth,
Yeah,
sixth century,
yeah,
but not in the third, second centuries. And
yeah.
Hippolytus is another great example where he is so zealous for Jesus, and
Hmm.
he wants no compromise with paganism, and he's willing to die for it. There's a passage in his commentary on Daniel where he's talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown in the fiery furnace because they refused to bow down to pagan gods, and he's
Hmm.
exhorting his audience to do the same thing. And he prays, he says, God, I pray that I too may be a martyr for you. And then 15 years later, he was sent to the mines and died a martyr's
Wow,
death. So he
wow.
he was he's the last guy you'd think would try and combine these two things together.
Yeah. So why do you think it is that the history of religions theory is so prevalent among the populace and also in a lot of scholarship? It seems like
Yeah,
it's real prevalent.
yeah. I think there's a few reasons. I mean, one is it's just an easy theory. Like
Hmm.
I've had to spend 45 minutes explaining the calculation theory.
Yeah.
And it's so much easier to be like, they just stole it from the pagans. But there's some history there. There was some anti-Catholic scholarship by Protestants in like the 17th, 18th centuries, maybe a little earlier, that were
Hmm.
trying to show the pagan roots of Christmas, because there's nowhere in the Bible that says celebrate
Sure.
Christmas, and so
Sure.
the Protestants were thinking, this must be a pagan origins. And then that, I think, gave the idea some credence. And then I think there's still some latent kind of anti-Christian
Hmm.
sentiment in the academy, that they're a little more willing to believe a simple narrative of they Rome, just the Bishop of Rome in the fourth century wanted to make pagans happy, and so just decided to put the birth of Jesus on that date. Um, but I when I talk with people, my idea, the calculation theory, when you explain it, is very well received. It makes a lot of sense,
It makes so
um,
much sense to me. Yeah.
and explains the data really well.
Hmm.
I think, in many ways, I mean, it's can be easy maybe for a modern person to look at the calculation theory and be like, I don't think Jesus had a perfect 9 month gestation. What if you're off by a day? But there's some beauty to the theory. I mean, they wanted Jesus to be born on the darkest night of the year, when the light of the
Hmm.
world would begin to shine on our
Sure.
souls. And
Sure.
that's beautiful. There's not God made the sun and the moon. There's nothing wrong with
Sure.
using those dates, and
Yeah.
and um, the vernal equinox corresponding with creation is it's this idea of God creating the heavens and the earth in perfect harmony, where everything is balanced. When he separated the light and the darkness, he did it exactly in half, that
Sure.
it was perfect in that sense. So there's a lot of beauty there. There's also some theology about, Paul says in First Corinthians, I think it's First Corinthians 5:17, I think it is. He says that Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us, and
Mhm.
that statement is so powerful because it highlights how Jesus is the Passover for believers. That He is the Paschal Lamb who takes away the sins of the world, and when if you want to push that even more, that which is what the early church did, is they're like, we think that Jesus was not only the perfect Passover and that he died on the Passover. We think that's when his earthly life began as well,
Mm.
also
Mm.
on the Passover, so that he had the Passover down, up, left,
Mhm.
right, and center.
Yeah.
And so there is this beauty to it, and I gotta say, December 25th is about as good a day as any, I think. So
Yeah.
when you look at the arguments that the early Christians are making, they're doing all this stuff with some stuff we haven't even gotten into, like with the age of Jesus, that Luke says he was about 30 years old, and they would say, okay, he was exactly 30,
When he was
exactly to the day.
baptized. Yeah.
And then the year of the Lord's favor, Jesus preached for literally 1 year,
Mm.
exactly. So and they do all this stuff, and they
Hmm.
reference. So I think if they were going with the tradition, you'd see a lot more of, hey, it's been passed down to us, so this is just what happened.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and that's not really what you see. They do. There is one case where the person says that, but most of them aren't really doing that. In the Latin tradition, there's a text that says Jesus was born
Hmm.
on the Passover, and clearly this author has no has, he doesn't know the difference between conception and birth, and he's not drawing from a tradition that is informing him. He's reading these chronologists and reading about their calculations, and then trying to do the same thing.
Hmm. Have you ever taught on this particular subject to a collegiate level class, or is that
Yeah, I
something
have
that?
a couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done that. Students are interested in it. They think it's
Oh
great.
yeah, I
They're like,
bet
"Oh,
they
this is
are. It's
awesome,"
probably like this, when you teach on
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
some subjects, they've not off, but um, you've been a blessing. You've been a blessing, brother. I think it's going to be very beneficial for our listeners. And there is so much. One of the reasons I've brought you on is there's so much on the internet and on YouTube for the history of religions theory. And whereas I don't think it makes as good of an argument as the calculation theory, there's just not as much uh, scholarly stuff on YouTube for the calculation theory. So I thought, well, you know what? Let's try to change that this year and put a few things out there by people that know a lot more than I do. And so you've been a blessing for sure.
I appreciate you having me on, Matthew. Thank you for all your good work.
All right, man. Have a great evening.
All right, God bless.
You too.